Now this returns a promise, so we have to await it to get the response. Now, because we are using await here, we have to make this component async. Now, this is the beauty of this approach. With this approach, we don't have to use a state variable. We don't have to use the effect hook with 0 dependencies. There's no ceremony. We just call fetch to get the data. And all of this happens on the server. You will see that in a minute. So we get the response. Then we call response.json. This also returns a promise. So we await it to get the data. In this case, our users. Next, we map these users to a bunch of list items, exactly like how we render them in a React application. So for our markup, let's replace this div with a fragment. Here we add an h1 called users. Then we add an unordered list, and here we map these users. We grab each user. Now, if you type user dot, look, we don't see anything because the compiler doesn't know about the type of these user objects. So if you hover our mouse over this constant, look, the type of this constant is any, which means we don't know. It could be anything. This is where we can use some TypeScript magic to improve our code. So outside of this component, we define an interface or a type called user. And here we say that each user has a property called ID of type number. It also has name of type string and so on. We could list all the properties we have here, but that is not necessary for this lesson. So we're going to keep things simple. So with this interface, we're defining the shape of our user objects. Okay. Now, where we declare this constant, we annotate it with its type, which is user array. Okay. With this, when we type user dot, we can see the properties of user objects. So this is the benefit of using TypeScript. With TypeScript, we get auto-completion when we're coding. And also, if we have any kind of errors like typos, we can catch those errors at build time before we run and deploy our application. Okay. So here we're going to map each user to a list item. First, we give it a key, which we set to user.id. And here we render user.name. That's all we had to do. So our code is simpler. There is no state and effect hook here. Our bundle is going to be smaller because this component will be on the server. Now back to the browser. Let's go to the users page. Here's our users, beautiful. Now let's bring up the network tab and refresh the page. So take a look at the document that we received from the backend. So all our users are rendered right here. This is because rendering is happening on the server. In contrast, in typical React applications or wherever we use client-side rendering, the browser initially gets a blank document. Then it will call the backend to fetch the data and then render the content. So there's always an extra round trip to the backend, and our application is not search engine friendly. So to fetch data, whenever possible, we should fetch it in server components. Fetching in server components has an extra benefit, and that is caching. What is caching? Well, the idea of caching is to store data somewhere that is faster to access. Basically, there are 3 places where we can get the data from. We can get it from the memory, from the file system, or from the network. Now, as we go down this list, getting data becomes slower. For example, getting data from the network is always slower than getting it from the file system. For this reason, Next.js comes with a built-in data cache. So whenever we use the fetch function to get some data, Next.js will automatically store the result in its data cache, which is based on the file system. So the next time we need the same piece of data, the next time we hit the same URL, Next.js is not going to go to JSON placeholder. It's going to get the data from its data cache, from the file system. Of course, we have full control over this caching behavior. If you have data that changes frequently, we can disable caching or treat data in cache as fresh for a certain period of time. Let me show you. So here, when we call the fetch function, we can pass a second argument, which is an options object. Let me put this on a new line so you can see clearly. In this object, we can set cache to no store to disable caching. That's one option. And this is useful if you have data that changes frequently. In those situations, we always want to show fresh data to our users, right? The other option is to keep data fresh for a certain period of time. To do that, instead of setting cache to no store, we set next to an object. In this object, we can specify configuration parameters that are specific to Next.js. So here we can set revalidate to value like 10. And this means Next.js is going to run a background job and get fresh data from the backend every 10 seconds. So this is how caching works in Next.js. Now, one thing you need to know is that this caching behavior is only implemented in the fetch function. So if you use a third-party library like Axios, you're not going to get this. You're not going to get the data cache. In Next.js, we have another performance optimization technique called static rendering or static site generation. The idea of static rendering is that if we have pages or components that have static data, we can have Next.js render them once when we build our application for production. So next time those pages or components are needed, Next.js is not going to re-render them. It's going to get their payload or content from its cache, which is based on the file system. This is static rendering, meaning rendering at build time. In comparison, we have dynamic rendering, which happens at request time. Let's see this in action. So back to our users page, let's add a timestamp above the list of users. So here we add a paragraph and render. First, we create a new data object and then call to locale time string. With this, we can see when this page was rendered.